AMD has delayed Zen 5 until a couple of weeks from now, the middle of August, and I'm here with Steve to have a bit of a chat about the situation. But before we get into it, we'll just read AMD's statement that they have provided to us and most of the media. So they say, "We appreciate the excitement around Ryzen 9000 series processors. During final checks, we found the initial production units that were shipped to our channel partners did not meet our full quality expectations. Out of an abundance of caution and to maintain the highest quality experiences for every Ryzen user, we are working with our channel partners to replace the initial production units with fresh units. As a result, there will be a short delay in retail availability. The Ryzen 7 9700X and Ryzen 5 9600X processors will now go on sale on August 8th, and the Ryzen 9 9950X and Ryzen 9 9900X processors will go on sale on August 15th. We pride ourselves in providing a high-quality experience for every Ryzen user, and we look forward to our fans having a great experience with the new Ryzen 9000 series." So initially, of course, these processors were expected to launch next week on July 31st, and they've pushed them back and actually staggered the release now so that the higher-end Ryzen 9 models will be coming a week later. They were originally all supposed to come at the same time. So initial thoughts, Steve, we got this info in the early parts of the morning while we were asleep. Wake up to this news, very surprising.
Sort of surprising. I had my suspicions that something like this was going on because obviously I don't have review samples, and as a reviewer, if they're coming out on the 31st of July, probably should have samples in hand. So I did contact AMD a few days ago, and cause usually I just let them take care of the process. You know, the samples arrive when they arrive, but it's getting uncomfortably close at this point in time. So I asked them what's going on, and they indicated that, yeah, look, it's not happening on the date that they'd previously announced, and that there will be further information to come. Unfortunately, that information came while we were fast asleep, so we couldn't provide this video sooner than we have. But it's also allowed us to do a little bit of digging around and find a few, I think, extra bits of information. So that's good. But yeah, I guess not terribly surprising given that generally speaking, we have samples in hand at least a week before they're meant to sort of hit shelves.
That's right. And AMD says this is only affecting their desktop processors. So they're also launching a whole bunch of other stuff. For example, their Strix Point processors for laptops, Zen 5 Epic processors, though I don't think those were launching right at the same time. But this apparently is only relating to the desktop Ryzen processors. So not necessarily a Zen 5 issue specifically in terms of like the architecture having some sort of problem with it or other issues, because again, the Zen 5 mobile launch, that's supposed to be coming out July 28th, I believe. So very soon from now. But yeah, only apparently affecting this and potentially not having any knock-on effects for other desktop processors that may be coming in the future, for example, X3D chips.
Doing a little bit of digging, it seems to be that sort of they did some last minute adjustments of their screening, their testing. So I guess you could put it under the heading of sort of a QC issue. Chips that previously passed the, I suppose, old testing, the new updated, more vigorous testing that they've now gone with, they don't quite pass. So I guess you could say under spec or whatever. So there'll be, yeah, as you say, it's not a Zen 5 architectural issue because it's not affecting, you know, other platforms, but it seems like they've tightened up the testing for desktop. Whether that has anything to do with, you know, the Intel situation, not sure, or they, for whatever last minute, decided to change whatever testing they were doing to be a bit more stringent, and then realized that some of the CPUs weren't passing that updated quality control. So if you were to get one of the CPUs that are in the channel now that should be recalled back to AMD, there is a chance that that CPU would be fine by the sounds of it. So there's just a certain percentage, unknown percentage, of CPUs that don't pass their new stringent testing.
It's a pretty interesting step to take to recall the CPUs that they've already sent out to retailers, because we were hearing a few reports that retailers, some of them at least, have received the chips already, or at least they're in the process of being sent to the retailers right now, and having to pull those back, retest them all, go through another quality control process is not something that we usually see for these sort of chips. Normally, if there's some sort of issue with the launch, that would happen before they're sent out. So the fact that this was caught very late in the process is certainly unusual, but there has been a few things related to the I don't know, launch time frame that's been a bit unusual relating to this. It seems like there's been a very short period between when the chips have been manufactured and when they were trying to release them. So whether that's because they've rushed the Ryzen 9000 launch or whether they just had to manufacture them pretty close to when they were trying to release them is interesting. And there was obviously that Italian review of the 9900X that was released a couple of days ago that showed some interesting performance things. I think you've done a bit of digging into this to see what the status was on that one.
Yeah, so obviously some retailers already had CPUs because he purchased one. I would have had to have thought it would be at least 4 or 5 days ago to produce a video 2 days ago. I'm not sure how much we can sort of read into that content. I don't think this guy is a PC hardware reviewer as such, but then I don't really understand or Italian, so it's hard to know. But he did test the CPU with DDR5 7200 memory, and I'm not sure that's going to be the optimal configuration, but I also don't know. And it's highly likely he doesn't know either. We haven't got the AMD review guide yet, so we're not sure what they're recommending and what the optimal configuration is there. But he found the 9900X, which is if you were able to review one of these Zen 5 CPUs ahead of time, before anyone else, the 9900X would probably be the last CPU you'd want to choose because it will, like all of the 7900X and the 5900X, they're the least popular, least interesting CPUs because you get the two CCDs with 6 cores. So it's not going to be a good gaming CPU, the 9900X. It seems very unlikely that it will be. Of course, we haven't got it and tested it for ourselves. But he found it to be, I think it was 9% slower than the 7800X 3D. I think it actually worked out the same way. The 7800X 3D was 9% faster. So 9% whichever way you slice it there. And that's for gaming at 1080p. But again, it was with DDR5 7200. I'm not even sure if the 7800X 3D was also tested with DDR5 7200, which absolutely is not an optimal configuration for that part either. But I sort of had a look at his Cyberpunk numbers, and his 7800X 3D Cyberpunk numbers are very similar to mine. With the similar settings. I don't know where he's testing or whatever. But if we take my 7800X 3D numbers and compare them to my 7900X numbers, that would make the 9900X about 18% faster than the 7900X. So that's a pretty big performance uplift if that was to be the case. But again, this is all so many different variables there that it's hard to judge. But yeah, look, he got a CPU ahead of time. From obviously a retailer or a distributor. From what I understand, whatever this quality control or issue, whatever it may be, it's my understanding that this does not impact performance in any way. So if his results are using optimal memory and whatever, that's basically how the CPU should perform. So he hasn't got a defective CPU in the sense that it's underperforming. Because I guess for us, we did see some sort of weirdness at Computex with that, with some early engineering samples. But I don't think performance is a concern here. It's something else, whether it's to do with, the final packaging of the CPU, whether that affects maybe something like thermals. I have no idea. But there is some additional testing that AMD was doing, and they weren't happy with some of them. So I guess they've tightened that binning process for certain parts. But yeah, hard to say exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting that you point out that it's potentially not an actual performance-related issue, because I think that would be the thing that most people would think of straight away, especially because of the weirdness around not just what you were saying with the Computex scenario that we had and we talked about, I think, in our podcast, as well as the Italian review. But there's been a lot of discussion about disappointing leaks. Not that I really pay too much attention to leaked numbers or non-final numbers, but for example, the discussion around this review was, the Italian review I'm talking about here, was that it being slower than the 7800X 3D goes against AMD's numbers that they were talking about their recent tech day, where they were claiming that, well, not necessarily the 9900X, but some Ryzen 9000 parts were going to be faster than that chip. So there's obviously that whole discussion, what was going on there? Is this some sort of issue? Is AMD perhaps over-promising a bit with their performance numbers? And then in those tech day numbers, there are a lot of discrepancies, things that I thought probably wouldn't be able to line up, the performance claims compared to 14th gen processors, the 5800X 3D, 7800X 3D. It didn't make a lot of sense. So there's been all this discussion about, oh, what's the actual performance of these parts going to be? There's been some Cinebench numbers as well for processors, a bit of discussion about maybe those being not as high as expected. And so I think when I was reading this morning some of the, feedback to this report that we were getting about the processors being delayed, the thinking was it's performance. There's some sort of performance issue with some of the chips. They're going to have to take them back and redo it. But you're saying that's not the case, which is certainly interesting.
Mm.
So now the processes are delayed. We didn't get review samples to begin with. What is the situation with review samples at the moment? Are you expecting them anytime soon, or are they really pushing this right to the limits?
Well, hopefully that isn't the case. I have heard that review samples are pretty much shipping now or very shortly, and that reviewers should have 7 to 10 days to prepare their reviews. So if that's the case, that would be very good. And I guess the delay would be welcomed, because we don't want a couple of days to evaluate a new architecture, test all these CPUs, and especially when all 4 of them were being released on the same day. And we do have some official information about the review embargo. We just got this information. So the 9600X and the 9700X, which will be on shelves on August 8th, the reviews for those will be a day early, so on the 7th. So that's pretty good. We usually like to have the reviews a day ahead so you guys can learn all there is to learn from the various media outlets about these products and then buy them. And then the same is also true for the Ryzen 9 parts. So August 15th on shelf, you'll see the reviews a day earlier on the 14th. So that's good. I also had it confirmed to me that this won't be a paper launch. So they're not delaying this because of some sort of supply issue or whatever. AMD says that there'll be really strong supply of these Zen 5 CPUs on those dates. So you should be able to get one. So that's all good news. Plenty of time for testing, and if you want one, you should be able to get one.
And personally, I think staggering the launch is a better approach from AMD anyway. It felt a little, not they haven't done this in the past, because previous Ryzen launches, they've launched all 4 CPUs on the same day. But I think with claiming that the parts were going to come in July, setting that date as July 31st, the absolute latest date they possibly could set to meet their initial promises for the launch, it really makes it so that a lot of the information that you're getting, there's so much information on that day, so many parts coming out, you have to sort through all the different bits and pieces, whereas staggering the release so that you're seeing the Ryzen 9 information after the other 2 CPUs is going to be, it's going to space things out a bit better, make it a bit easier to understand what's going on, because usually the focus with like a Ryzen 7 part and Ryzen 5 part will be gaming performance. How are they going to compare to 7800 XRD? Are these good value chips to buy for gaming? And then the Ryzen 9 stuff is interesting from another perspective. They're not so much gaming parts, they're productivity CPUs. So you want to see how they compare in productivity applications. And when you've got all that information just being slammed at once, I think some of the interesting things that can come out of these processes can get lost a bit as people focus on gaming or the productivity stuff. But with this split, we'll be able to cover gaming first, really focus on that for the lower tier models, and then really dive into what the multi-core performance is going to be like for the top tier processors. So I would have loved to see this be the release strategy to begin with, but sort of with that delay, they've almost been forced into it, which is interesting.
Yeah, were they forced into it, or did they finally decide that was a better way? I have no idea. It's hard to say, but I absolutely agree with you. Having them at least a week apart is the way to go. And yeah, as you say, the Ryzen 5, Ryzen 7 parts, they sort of make sense to be together. And then Ryzen 9, we can focus more on productivity there. And of course, we'll still look at gaming, but they're just so different. The CPUs, they're targeted at different people. So to have them all lumped into one review just doesn't make sense. And I know we've been accused in the past, and I suppose this would apply for others like Gamers Nexus or whatever, for milking these releases by giving you, a video each day. So that typically, if they're all released on the same day, we would have done 4 reviews, and staggered them a day apart, because that works best on YouTube. And we're not doing that simply to milk it at all. It's so we can give each product its own individual review, evaluate it as it should be. And if you're generally someone who's looking at a Ryzen 5 9600X anyway, doesn't really care about the 9950X, like they're 2 very different use cases, 2 different very buyers. So you really want a review that's focused specifically on the part that you're interested in. So we try and tailor the reviews that way. And now, we'll still be doing individual reviews for each CPU, I imagine, but it just means you'll get, one review and the other one, then you'll wait a week and, we'll do the same thing again. So great way of going about it, I think.
The other interesting thing here is that we still do not have Zen 5 pricing. So while they have pushed back the release date by a couple of weeks, no word on official MSRPs for these processors. We're seeing some retail leaks of pricing in various different regions. I always find that it's not necessarily, you're not able to read into that too much, because there's a lot of retailers that like to put up placeholder pricing, or just guess, or even, maybe they do it for a little bit of marketing, put up a price, and then you get a bit of attention from some of those websites. But I wouldn't be reading too much into those pricing. I don't think that with previous launches, previous products, that retail pricing ahead of any official announcement has ever been all that accurate or that representative of what the actual pricing will be. So, yeah, it's still unusual that we haven't got pricing. It sounds more like this will be a review type thing where they release it very close to the reviews or on the day of the reviews. But I personally would have liked to, if you're going to delay the parts, maybe give us some information about pricing, but that hasn't happened, unfortunately.
Not much more we can say about that. I don't even know if that'll be in the review guides that we should be getting next week, because it's not a given that you get pricing in the review guide either. And for those that don't know what a review guide is, basically a review guide is sort of a summary of the product, and it shows AMD's internal testing as a guidance. So because when you get a new architecture, are the numbers am I getting, are they right? Are they close? Is there something wrong? So they just let you know what you should be aiming for. So a good guide in that sense, but doesn't always include all the relevant information. Sometimes you've got to go digging for that. And in the past, AMD has withheld pricing information to almost the final hour, which is a bit of a nightmare for us because it makes it very difficult to review the product, set the tone, what are we comparing it to, and stuff like that. With these CPUs, it's a little bit more straightforward because surely the 9600X is replacing the 7600X, so we can kind of guess where it needs to be in terms of pricing, but it's good to get that information ahead of time. So hopefully, given this hiccup, let's say, AMD doesn't cause any further hiccups by withholding basic information like pricing. But I think overall the delay is a good idea. I'm all for delays with these sort of things, especially when it's not a serious delay. And 2 weeks we're being delayed on the first two parts, and then 3 weeks for the Ryzen 9 part. So I don't think that's terrible. And really, with what's going on with Intel at the moment, AMD doesn't want to fumble this launch. I wouldn't even be surprised if the Intel pain at the moment has caused AMD to tighten up on some of this screening that they're doing. And as a result, we're seeing this. But we've seen plenty of AMD-related releases with Radeon GPUs and whatnot that have gone a bit awry at the last minute. What is it? The 5600X had a BIOS change, and we've had pricing changes even for the latest generation things. Was it Zen 3 that had the boost clock issue where the CPUs were under, I think the peak?
I think so.
Yeah. And that was like, I don't want to downplay this or anything, but at the same time, that wasn't a big issue and it was easily addressable. Obviously, if they're advertising a frequency, they should be hitting it, but they weren't miles off. It was almost like a rounding error. I think in most instances it was about 50 megahertz. They were off achieving that, and then a Jigsaw code update solved that. So in the grand scheme of things, it was a minor problem. It was something that turned out to be easily addressable, which it looked like it always was going to be. But despite that, it was a huge problem for AMD. There was a lot of drama. People were worried that the CPUs were defective and they couldn't do what AMD said they could do, and then, so on and so forth. And then AMD came out pretty early on and said, look, we can definitely solve this problem. It's just a bug in the Jigsaw code. And the next update, which will be rolling out very soon, will solve it. And that certainly was the case. But yeah, so something like that can cause a lot of problems. And we see, with new architectures and things like that all the time, teething issues, problems, and they can create quite a bit of drama. And the last thing AMD wants around their shiny new Zen 5 release is a whole lot of drama.
Yeah, I think the lesson from that a lot of companies should be taking out of this, and AMD seems to have taken this lesson, is that delaying the launch of a product that isn't quite ready is the easiest and best thing that you can do generally for a product launch. Because there might be a few comments saying about how AMD is, stuffed up the launch in some way from people by delaying it, or whatever the case. That is going to be forgotten by the time the processors are out and you're seeing the performance numbers and the reviews are out. Whereas What they can't fix is that if the reviews are coming out and people have tested a broken product or a product with some sort of issue, that leaves a lasting impression. The initial, we've talked about this many times with GPUs, specifically Radeon GPUs, about launching with, pricing that isn't up to standard, or in the past there's been last minute changes, the RX 7600 changing the price the day before. And in the past, there's even been, changes to product specifications right before the products come out. So avoiding that sets a much better tone for these reviews. It's going to mean that, well, hopefully, provided they've solved whatever problem they've found, there's not going to be that sort of discussion around the launch. If people are finding issues, they've had at least a couple of weeks extra to solve those issues. And I think if other companies, or maybe AMD for future products, maybe Radeon, maybe they'll hopefully learn some lessons there. The launch is something that you really need to get right, and you really need to be ensuring that you're setting a really good tone for the product. And so delaying these products, making sure that everything is working up to the standard that it should be, is 100% the right move every time.
Mhm.
So hopefully not too many people are going to be complaining about this and making out that AMD has botched this in some way, because they haven't. They've trying to avoid that as best as possible. And I think they need to have, any company should get leniency for delaying things to ensure that it's as good as it possibly can be.
Mhm. Yeah, well, the most important thing at this point in time is that no consumers have been burnt by this. So,
Yeah.
sure, there's a bit of disappointment having to wait an extra 2 weeks, but it would be a lot worse if people had bought these CPUs and then a percentage of them that were sold weren't up to spec, weren't doing what they were meant to be doing, whatever that may be. And then you've got to find out, like, this is the problem with the Intel thing, right? Like, is your CPU affected? Has it been affected? Will the microcode update solve the problem? Will you still be getting, stability problems and whatnot? And then can you get that replaced? And it's just a headache. And regardless of whether you can or whether they do or don't replace it, obviously they should replace it, but you've got to go through that whole process. You don't want to give AMD or Intel a ton of money for a product and then have to deal with all of that. You want it to just work. It's a really bad experience when you part with money and then get, a product that doesn't work. So
yeah, you don't want there to be any questions about it, because even with like that Zen 3 clock situation that you were talking about earlier, there was that whole, people were looking into very deeply the specifications and operating parameters of their processor, trying to figure out, like, is this what it should be doing? Is this not what it should be doing? Is my processor working properly? And you just want to avoid that as much as possible.
Yeah, and they did, right? They rushed this massively, it seems. They were really sprinting to the end to make this launch happen, when they probably should have given themselves an extra month. I don't think there was any reason to rush it out. I think we first caught wind of it being heavily rushed probably at Computex, right? Was that the first time it sort of... we talked about this on our podcast, so for those of you who don't watch the Hardware Unboxed podcast, well, shame on you, I suppose, but no.
Okay.
Had to get that in there, Tim. Come on, what are you doing if you're not watching the Hardware Unboxed podcast? No, look, we talked about it at Computex. We went to an AMD live demo, which they had a Cinebench benchmark showing I think it was the 9950X versus the 14900K, if I recall correctly.
Yep, I think so.
And they were showing the 14900K scoring higher than the new Zen 5 CPU. And somehow no one had twigged that was not correct. And Tim and I sort of said, what's going on with the score? Why is the 9950X slower than a 7950X? And then, people started running around and it raised alarm bells. And anyway, they got back to us a day later saying that they were actually supplying these systems with early engineering samples that were underperforming. So probably not good to have a Cinebench benchmark on an early engineering sample CPU that was underperforming. So I think they probably removed that once we pointed that out. So given that the launch was only, 8 weeks or something after Computex?
Yep.
It suggested to us that this was going to be very rushed to the end, and that's certainly been the case.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to whether there'll ever be a proper explanation as to what the issue was with these processors. I don't imagine AMD will provide official information. Their statement is, you don't really want to be producing a statement saying, hey, we broke this just ahead of launch. But it'll be interesting whether people will be able to investigate and find what the specific problem was.
It sounds very much like it is a testing thing, that they've changed the testing of the CPUs. Whatever testing they do to qualify the CPUs, they've gone with more demanding testing.
Yeah,
Look,
possibly.
it could be very similar to the Zen 3 issue we saw. It could be a repeat of that, where by doing this increased testing, this heavier workload, that some certain percentage of the CPUs weren't boosting correctly. It could just be a repeat of that because we've seen that before. But really, we're just guessing. We have no idea. But AMD says it's not major, and they can solve it very quickly, which, as I said, it seems like that is true if they're already preparing to send out review samples. So it seems like there was an issue. The issue has now been addressed, but that is going to cause a 2-week delay.
Yeah, so I think that pretty much does it for this little video talking about Ryzen 9000 delays and our thoughts. So hopefully you all have enjoyed this podcast discussion format. As Steve said, if you don't listen to the Hardware Unboxed podcast, this is pretty much what we do on that show.
Except we talk about like mowing lawns.
Well, there's a bit of that.
Tim's automated watering system, bad Star Wars, bad Marvel. It's basically the podcast minus all of that stuff.
So we will be having an episode of that coming up in the next couple of days. We'll probably follow up on this, see what people's reactions are to the news, and talk a little bit more about that. So the Hardware Unboxed podcast episode that's coming up in a couple of days is probably one to look out for. And we'll also be discussing, of course, the Intel situation, the developments there, Intel's statement. So if you are interested in all of that, our thoughts and discussion on that, the podcast is a great place to get that. And there'll be a new episode in a few days. Until then, though, I think that pretty much does it for this Hardware Unboxed episode. It's great to have a chat with you on the channel like this. Love doing these sorts of things. So, yeah, bit of fun. And, well, I guess I'm your host, Tim.
I'm your host, Dave.
We'll see you in the next one.